Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Gia Hamilton, the CEO of the New Orleans African American Museum. How are you doing today, Gia?
Hello, I'm doing great. It's great to be with you today.
Likewise, thanks for joining. So, getting right into things, can you tell us more or tell us about your journey to becoming the CEO of the museum and what inspired you to pursue a career in the museum sector?
Yeah, my path has been a winding path. And so when I talk to young people about my career choices, one of the things that I always state is that I start and end with my passion and my purpose. So this road has not been a sort of linear, straight path in museum studies or even in art history. It's really been a distinct journey, which I think is important as our economy shifts and as industries shift, which is I started off really in anthropology. So caring very much about people, their stories, the way that we use stories. But I'm also a maker. I'm an artist. So I minored in studio art and have always had an appreciation for the creative process. Um, I started that career in New York City. I'm not from there, but I was there going to school and was just deeply immersed in a city that is all about the creative process and how you're
Mhm.
able to sustain yourself and find yourself. And so I found myself in a couple of spaces. One in the public school system as a teaching artist, right? Like many of us who are starting out do. I found myself also writing curriculum and then later on helping to start a school called Little Maroons in Brooklyn, along with 7 other amazing families. So really thinking about like pedagogy and the way in which we work creativity into just the classroom, like everyday life. And then also in the sort of artist community in Brooklyn, right? Like making things and being a part of curatorial process. So really thinking about like how curators build out worlds and conceptualize things and frame things for the general public to consider and to think about, to push back against. And so through that sort of like 10 to 12-year period of my life, I think I would say I was deeply immersed in the making of things and the connecting of people. But I've also cared very much about the land that I inhabit, the history of the land that I inhabit or care for or steward. And I learned that work by being a farmer, believe it or not. And that work of being a farmer turned into the stewardship of like real estate development. And so where my really interesting, unique path comes in is as a sort of artist, entrepreneur, real estate development, like that intersection of those things and how we do placekeeping work, how we build upon things that have already existed, making sure to expand narratives and to push back against mainstream cultural narratives and tropes, specifically about Black folk,
Right.
and to make sure that the creative process, the artistic process is honored, and not just that the artistic process is honored, but that the artist or the culture bearer is honored in the process. And
Mm.
so I find myself after years of doing work in galleries and art fairs and biennials and independent curatorial projects and even residency programs, coming to the New Orleans African American Museum in 2019. I live and work in Treme. I saw that our museum was closed. This museum had been closed for 7 years. And I felt like many entrepreneurs do, right? This call to solve a problem, like a deep cultural problem that is obviously rooted in industry and business and in business infrastructure. And so that's what really led me to the work. From a sort of esoteric perspective, I feel like I was kind of called there. And I'll touch on that, I think, a little bit later. There's some things that enticed me to the land, so to speak.
Interesting. And how do you, when it comes to the museum and its mission, how do you ensure that it's, I guess, the vision is effectively communicated to the visitors that come and to the wider community?
It's interesting because, at the New Orleans African American Museum, we consider ourselves a living museum. And so the distinction for me is that We expect and need our visitors to be sort of active participants in creating, co-creating some of the experiences, meaning like there are some deeply immersive experiences that happen there that are about personal development, that are about like collective and community development, right? So it
Mhm.
isn't simply a process of us putting things up, right, as the scholar or the knower for the viewer to take in and consume. This is really for us about a call and response, which feels really sort of indicative of the Black experience, right? Of Black consciousness. Call and response is really a part of how we create and how we muse with one another and connect the dots. For me, that sort of link or lineage is really rooted in this idea that like museums are rooted in the museum in the human zoo. So this idea that like people and their objects or their cultures or their practices were extracted from their place of origin, they were interpreted and reinterpreted and misinterpreted, right? And put on display for the other, right? Or for the mainstream. And then we start to see this collection of things, this collection of assets as we see colonialism grow. And then we see the big sort of building to house these things, right? Like all of
Mm.
these structures for me are sort of really rooted in colonial thought, which in my position at the New Orleans African American Museum is really about like how do we decolonize museums? What does that actually look like and mean?
Right.
And what is our responsibility as leaders to really put forth new models so that museums actually become a place of inspiration, of connection, of creativity for human problem solving, right? Which
Mm.
is what I think we ultimately are trying to do in terms of serving that mission. And so we do that in two ways, we think, two basic ways. We do that by unpacking and telling narratives and stories that are not known, that distill things down into this human experience. So, people, right? So, not just sort of couching everything as just a Black experience, but really
Right.
going into put the peculiarities, the nuances of what a personal experience might be or its impact on the bigger picture. And then we do that through our like contemporary work. So we're always creating a storyline or thread between the history and the contemporary, the now, right? And we do that in particular through notions around Afrofuturism. So
Mm.
for us, it's a lot of fun because we're able to capture the attention of a really wide audience, right? Everyone from like very, very young children who want to be able to touch and do things in a tactile way
Yeah.
to a sort of elder who is looking to have some aspect of their history or their narrative or something they relate to
Mhm.
expressed, acknowledged, right, or told by and for them, right? So those are the two ways that I think we do that really well.
Interesting. And what are some examples of some community-driven, like, initiatives or collaborations that stand out, to you personally?
Yeah, one of the really important and profound um, aspects of the work is listening to the now, to the people who are there and present. So I'll kind of situate us a little bit.
Mhm.
Our work is situated on a 2-acre campus. We have 7 historic buildings in historic Treme, which is about 4 blocks outside of the French Quarter. Treme is considered the oldest Black neighborhood in the country. And so I give you that history to say, you know, New Orleans was the second largest port of people of African descent. Charleston was the first. And so we like to say more Black bodies came through New Orleans than anywhere else in North America,
Mm.
truly. And so lots of people can find their roots kind of very literally in terms of their genealogy, but also spiritually, esoterically, energetically, right? People find their like Caribbean and African roots through New Orleans. There's this through point. And so for us, an example would be learning that this was one of the oldest Black neighborhoods where Black people owned property in the 1800s, Black women in particular. It's been really interesting to learn that there are only 30 remaining originally rooted families.
Mm.
So, one of our first initiatives, of course, was this sense of urgency around capturing the oral histories of the people who are from these neighborhoods, some of whom can trace their family lineage back literally to the 1700s, some of them the 1800s. I mean, it's such an important part of what I would consider American history and the way in which we define American culture,
Yeah,
right? Especially if we describe like the birthplace of jazz being right this red light district in Treme. So
super.
that, I mean, that to me, that's an example of a project that is very driven by
Mhm.
um, the shifting, changing neighborhood, the landscape of the neighborhood, the people in the neighborhood, and the responsibility that we as a museum have to those stories.
Thanks for sharing that. So, what are your thoughts on the importance of preserving Black spaces, and what is the museum doing to preserve its own space?
Well, it's so interesting, right? Because we have a hashtag now, Black Museums Matter, because truly we believe at the African American museums that these are sacred spaces. These are spaces that consider blackness like as a priority. They center blackness and they center black people, which means that we have a responsibility to really think about like the multitude of black people, right? We're not monolithic, the different types of black folks that want access to black spaces that are safe spaces, that are creative spaces, that are connecting spaces for them. And that's a beautiful, fun challenge for us, right? And so for us, we're always thinking about the person who does not feel comfortable walking into a museum or a gallery space for whatever reason, right? Like all of the ways that all the reasons we know and all the reasons that we can imagine. We want to create space so that those individuals feel like they get the visual cues, they get the sensorial cues that this is a space for them, right? And we know that there's an aesthetic and a sort of welcoming nature in how we think about hospitality, right? In the South, the city that's driven by tourism, that we have to think about that radically different to make space for the person that has traditionally been excluded from participating, seeing, interpreting, and enjoying work, quite frankly, that comes from their culture.
Mm.
So for us, like this is really essential to personal development, right? Because museums and other art spaces should be a place of inspiration, and it's also really central to community development or collective consciousness, if you will, because we are places where we can have lots of different ideas about how to move forward, how to think about Black people, Blackness in the future. And that means that we have to set up spaces for that to happen. So our team, we cherish the way that we think about our space. Everything from the smells to who is greeting you to how you're being greeted to any follow up that we do,
Mm.
to making sure that we speak to and smile and welcome the guests and the visitors that are coming into our space. So that's to me why Black spaces are so important, right? You feel good when you
Mm.
feel taken care of, you feel seen and heard. And
Right.
that is everything that our visitors should feel, regardless of who they are.
I agree. And we talk a lot about funding or financing for Black-owned businesses. Like, what are the challenges or the strategies that you've implemented to secure sustainable funding for the museum and its growth?
I mean, I think that's such a great question, right? Like the New Orleans African American Museum was closed for 7 years. So this is a museum that opened in the 1990s. It opened with great vigor and leadership under former Mayor Mark Morial, who's now, of course, the CEO of the Urban League and doing amazing things. He is still connected to us via the National Advisory Committee. And I think we're a museum that when we closed, it was devastating to the Black community, right? There was no longer a centralized place. And I think that there are lots of other cultural institutions that came in and played a real substantial role in the lives of cultural retention in the city. But for us, we are in such a centralized location. Our buildings tell a story, right? They tell the story of Black female ownership in the 1800s. The people in the neighborhood tell stories, and then our collection tells a story, right? And so for us, this has been a journey of really believing and having faith in things that are unseen. This was really about an entrepreneurial journey, of heavily relying on earned income for the
Mm.
first 2 years of this work, while we built a really strong business infrastructure. And so for all those folks who are doing really similar work, I say to you, as a curator and as a creative, I had to really balance the creative work that I love, that I could spend all day in, by saying I have to prioritize the business infrastructure. That if I'm going to do legacy work, and legacy work that is based on the elders in my community, like Mr. Al Jackson and Mama Carol Bell and John O'Neill and others, that I have a responsibility to use the very unique skill set that I have to really think through how this is a strong and sustainable business model, not just for myself, but really past my own tenure.
Mm.
So again, I think those of us who are in leadership positions, it's using that 7 generations ahead framework, right? Like what I'm doing today supports generations ahead, which meant, quite frankly, Tony, I had to slow down my pace. It was really important to be consistent. So rather than ideate and iterate like you might do in, today's sort of startup environment, you were doing those things, but doing them at a much more deliberate, intentional pace so that you could move at the rate of trust with your community, right? So rather than sort of putting out a product, testing, iterating, I really had to have like a very strong listening ear, be responsive, be thoughtful, and at times say, we're not there yet. So putting on the brakes, putting on the pauses. And so what we've done is we were able to, at the end of COVID in 2020, build a compelling case for why this was an important business to invest in. And so we were able to really hone in on earned income first. And I think that that was significant. And then begin to really layer that with big philanthropy. And I really at this point want to share some of the funders, because I think that there are good people doing good work in philanthropy and they deserve that credit. I think the Open Society Foundation and Rashida Bumbray and now Ioka Wiles made a first huge multi-year investment in the museum, which meant they really, on paper, we're saying we are willing to take a risk because we see the vision and we understand the importance of this place. The Mellon Foundation and Elizabeth Alexander, Deb Cullen and her team, and then finally Kresge, and the Greater New Orleans Foundation right here in New Orleans, Carmen Randall, now Kelly Green and Andy Koppel, right? Like those are people who I could have very real business conversations with and could walk away almost like those investment conversations with them saying, we see the vision and we also see the possibility of this performance, right? So we can see where, when this full campus is activated, where this business model is going. But I can't stress enough the need for business modeling, for financial modeling, and for doing sometimes that work that many of us in the nonprofit sector don't consider the fun work, right? It's the invisible, unsexy work.
Right, right. And speaking of the vision, like looking ahead, what are some of the upcoming projects or initiatives that the museum is working on?
I mean, that part I could talk about all day, but I have to really sort of preface it by saying, as just this continuation of our story, when I started off in 2019, I reopened a museum that had been closed for 7 years. Literally, when I say I restarted it, I meant like our collection, which did not have acquisition records. The one building that we had access to that was renovated was completely empty. So every single thing that people see now has been created since 2019, which is pretty profound when I think about it. I'm really, really proud of that work and the people that I've had a chance to work with. The other thing that I'll just say in relationship to your last question that kind of like tethers into the next question is like, we had debt, right? And so like there are many Black and brown cultural institutions that get into predatory lending agreements or just into business relationships that are that they don't have an exit plan for, right? So like when we're talking to investors, like, investors want to know, like, what's your exit plan? How do you give me back my investment, right? Plus my return, and then make a sustainable business. That's no different in the nonprofit world, right? Except for the fact that we're reinvesting and constantly reinvesting in the business model. So for us, what was really essential is that we could identify and then retire and professionalize all of our debt. So it
Mm,
took 4 years to do that. 4 very hard years during COVID and also during Hurricane Isaac. But in May of this year, we were able to really present a professionalized debt program and retire all of our previous debt,
mm,
be in the black with reserves. So to just sit with that for a second, um, and to really think about the fact that this for us constituted a sort of ground zero. It
mm,
constituted a moment for Black leadership, for my colleagues, the board, the incredible board that we work with, um, our funders, our community, to actually celebrate what we're saying is like an unshackling of the land, right? That's really what we were doing. We were
mm,
doing ancestral work to unshackle this land so that we can imagine the future together. And we kind of culminated that in a ritual, right? Which is part of what Black folks do, which I love. I love being a Black person. We did this with an amazing group called the Maroons and
mm,
a project that they had called the Bobancha Rise Up. And so, to your point about what people can expect and what's coming down the pipeline, I mentioned placekeeping earlier. And so, we are really centered on returning to this place before New Orleans was called New Orleans, right? Before it was a colony of France, before it was this cosmopolitan sort of city that was also deeply immersed in the transatlantic slave trade, right? This city, this landmass was called Bobancha.
mm,
Bobancha loosely translates into the land of many tongues. It was inhabited by 82 indigenous tribes of people. So there are these wonderful maps and work that scholars, indigenous scholars, Black folk, white folks are all putting together at this point. And they're important because our relationship with the indigenous, as people of African descent, is completely interwoven and interconnected, right? When oppressed people um, are oppressed, they're always thinking about liberation and freedom, right? And so I love sharing that point with our young people. So
mm,
one of the things that I think people can expect is that you're going to start to get this sort of pre-colonial history that is completely exceptional to me. It sort of grounds and reminds me that New Orleans is a 300-year-old city in America, right? Like we're one of the oldest cities, 1718. And so we kind of represent the antiquity of, America, so to speak. So there's so many things that have their origin point in this particular place, culturally and otherwise, that it feels right to partner in this way with our indigenous community, to really to make that a genesis point. And so to that point, we're really working on shifting the street name that we have called Governor Nichols, and really reminding and placing markers for people that this was actually, our street was a 5,000-year-old Chitimacha trail. 5,000-year-old, right? Trading trail. When people of African descent came, this this same passageway also became a maroon passageway out of the city.
mm,
The city being the French Quarter. So that was the city. And anytime you went outside of the French Quarter, you were outside of the city. You were in a faubourg or a suburb, right? And so Treme was really the first suburb of the city of New Orleans. And so there's so many things about our land and the things that took place that are just exceptional and are inspiring
mm,
to the stories. And so for me, it's a wonderful thing to think about us starting our narrative journey in a pre-colonial history.
Mm,
So that's one of the really exciting things. We're working with Dr. Angel Parnham, who is at the University of Virginia. She's our first scholar in residence, and she's writing her second book partially on our campus. So she's doing a lot of work to translate notarial records from Louisiana Creole, French Creole, right, New Orleans Creole, all of which are different aspects of
mm,
creolized languages, so that we can start to tell the story of the actual houses. A good example would be the Villa Mayor, which is the main house that everybody recognizes. That house was built in 1829, and it actually fell into the hands of a Black woman. And what we want to uncover right now is, how did this happen? When did this happen? What does this mean? And what does this imply for our narratives and history as as a community? And how does that narrative inspire young Black people, right, to understand, like, if our ancestors were doing this work in the 1800s and the 1700s, what does that inspire you to do now? So those are just a couple of kind of little sprinkles of things that are to come. And then I'd say the final thing is that we will really be fully activated, I believe, when our full campus is renovated. And, I mentioned we're a
mm,
2 acre campus,
mhm,
7 historic buildings. We have a $15 to $18 million capital development project that's going to be underway. And so now that we have professionalized this debt, we're actually free to start to think about the development of this campus in a different way. So that's really where we are. We're looking for the donors and the patrons of the diaspora to really see the importance of this work and
mm.
to give their dollar, right? So I think you and I, we really believe in, like, how do we support Black owned businesses?
Definitely, definitely. No, that's super exciting. Lots of amazing things lined up, and I know the museum's going to be doing amazing things from here on. Gia, thank you so much for stopping by and sharing all that information.
Thank
For
you.
anyone who's like in New Orleans or plans to go to New Orleans, how do they get in contact? What is the best way to, connect with the museum and you yourself?
Oh, well, I thank you, thank you, thank you. I would say definitely starting out by going to our website, which is www.noaam.org. So just our acronym, New Orleans African American Museum.org.
Mhm.
Um, we book tours online, we rent our space. We do a wonderful Treme experience, which is a half-day tour in addition to like the hourly tours that we do. We have rotating exhibitions and activations, a really robust, beautiful public program that's run by our new creative producer, Cameron Mitchell Ware, also native and local New Orleanian. And, we're so excited. We want to connect with our visitors far and near. We have an international audience. We have a national audience of people who come into the city. And we want you to feel like you haven't really experienced New Orleans unless you've come to the African American Museum here. So I would say, if you're interested in my own personal practice, of which I'm always working on and tweaking and evolving, you can follow me on my website, which is GiaHamiltonStudio.com. And so I'm always thinking about my own process of, cultural narratives, the way that we use those cultural narratives in the contemporary art world, and the
Mm,
projects that I'm working on there.
amazing.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for having me.
No, of course. It was a pleasure. Please, like, we need to do this again because I know there are going to be, again, as you said, many more amazing things happening. So let's stay in contact. And thanks for stopping by.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Gia. Take care.